Ettiene de la Boetie, who lived from 1530 until 1563, had a short life, but he lived long enough to transition from being a youthful anarchist to a conservative with a secure job in the bureaucracy. He even advocated religious persecution because he believed royal authority required a state religion. Living before the religious wars of France, which ran from the 1560s to the 1590s, he wrote against absolute monarchy before absolutism was even firmly established in France. So let us forget the conservative and very institutional turn that his life took at the end and instead focus on the young radical de la Boetie and his essay on voluntary servitude. In any case, this is what most people tend to remember about him. It seems that de la Boetie is the kind of writer who reemerged whenever he was needed by the French people to oppose some vicious tyrant. He was popular, for instance, during the French Revolution and later on in 1848, during the revolution that spread across all of Europe. His own historical context was during the aftermath of the rise of the so-called Renaissance monarchs. This term applies mostly to Henry VII of England, Louis XI of France, Francis I of France, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, and a handful of other Western European monarchs. They achieved something none of the medieval monarchs were able to do, which was to really expand the power of state over society. They did this through war, through building up state institutions, through laws, and through the undermining of feudal vassals. Consolidation also took place in the Italian republics and in other European states. States simply were doing a better job of measuring the number of people, doing a better job of imposing religious unity, and this ties into Reformation politics, and also a much better job of extracting revenues, which were necessary due to the changing in warfare, requiring the use of professional salaried soldiers instead of knights and vassals who were paid with land and mutual obligations. The Battle of Agincourt ended the age of the knight and introduced the age of the professional soldier, but professional soldiers took money, and as wars expanded in early modern Europe, so did the need for money. In terms of France, Ettiene de la Boetie lived during the height of the Habsburg-Valois conflict. Francis I was king for much of Ettiene de la Boetie's short life. Francis died in 1547, and he was followed by Henry II, who famously died in a tournament accident. His successor was Charles IX, who was dominated by his mother. His rise would usher in the political turmoil that would accompany the French wars of religion. And as you might remember from your Western Civ courses, the French wars of religions really corresponded with dynastic conflicts over who would rule France. So from someone of de la Boetie's generation, they would have seen both dynastic weakness and turmoil and dynastic strength in figures like Francis I. He was probably responding mostly to the rising power of monarchs like Francis I, who rapidly expanded their power over society to fuel their European ambitions. And those ambitions most commonly manifest in war. And it seems in the short passage I've read of de la Boetie that he's obsessed with the military ambitions of European kings. So the text I want to look at here is on voluntary servitude. It was an essay written in 1552 when de la Boetie was still in school. It's a work that he is most well known for, and it's the major contribution that he makes to anarchist writing. In this work, he provides a not very flattering picture of exploited people, but he also provides the foundation for an important theory of resistance known as civil disobedience. He asks the question that all of us must have thought about at some point in our lives, especially when we're at our most frustrated at the survival of injustice or oppression in our world. And that is, why does anyone follow rulers at all? He asks the question quite eloquently. Quote, I should like merely to understand how it happens that so many men, so many villages, so many cities, so many nations sometimes suffer under a single tyrant who has no other power than the power they give to him, who is able to harm them only to the extent to which they have the willingness to bear with him. End quote. The first theory that he proffers is that simple habit resulted from the necessity of submission is the fault. He states the obvious, quote, we can't always be the stronger. This is the thinking of Thomas Hobbes, who believed that the state of nature was simply a violent dog-eat-dog world. But of course, Thomas Hobbes uses this idea to lead to the necessity of the state. And that suggests that maybe de la Boetie doesn't want to go down that road. His question is deeper, though. It's not that why does my neighbor who's stronger than me steal from me? Or why does the stronger kid on the playground bully the weaker kid? He's not asking why one person may cower in front of a stronger person. That's self-evident and obvious. He wants to know why millions cower before one. Strength and simple violent domination cannot, for him, be the answer. And how do the subjugated suffer in de la Boetie's view? Quite a lot. Quote, "These wretches have no wealth, no kin, nor wife, nor children, nor even life itself that they can call their own. They suffer plundering, wantonness, cruelty, not from any army, not from any barbarian horde, on account of whom they must shed their blood and sacrifice their lives, but from a single man. Not from a Hercules nor from a Samson, but from a single little man." End quote. Now we do have a nice image here of the monarch as a single little man, which is always important to keep in mind. But in this situation, accepting the tyranny of one man is worse than cowardice. It is, in his words, a vice for which no term can be found vile enough. He then talks about the cultural power of the struggle against tyranny. But how is it that this never seems to go beyond the cultural realm? Why is it that we can read with fascination books of the struggle against tyranny in some distant land, but not do it in our own lives? We seem obsessed and fascinated with freedom, in fact. When push comes to shove, we usually fail to liberate ourselves as easily as could be. How many of us to this day watch movies or shows celebrating the struggle for freedom, but then accept the degradation of our own employers or spouses or parents or some other authoritarian force in our lives? The conclusion de la Boetie comes to is that a people must be enslaving themselves. Quote, "A people enslaves itself, cuts its own throat, when, having a choice between being a vassal and being free men, it deserts its liberties and takes on the yoke, gives consent to its own misery, or rather apparently welcomes it." In this essay, he also talks about the nature of power, and particularly its nature to expand and consume and spread. He compares the tyrant to the spark, easily put out with a bit of water or by smashing it underfoot, but if left alone, will expand inevitably into a raging inferno. It is in the nature of the tyrant to consume more, to tax more, to war more, to conquer more. Still, a fire can still be put out simply by taking away its fuel. And in our lives, that means simply refusing to accept the tyrant's rule. And this is the core idea of civil disobedience that de la Boetie presents in this essay. But we can still stop here and wonder if de la Boetie is blaming the victims a bit too much. Certainly, he did not understand the psychology of power, the powerful emotional urges that lead people by the millions to fight for and die for flags, the ceaseless demands for community and solidarity, often absent in our own lives, that are filled with worship to the state. And he doesn't really account for just bear the burden of poverty and suffering and the need for a basic survival and how that can be used. That need can be used by the powerful. It turns out that he does have a sort of answer for this. It may not be entirely satisfying, but he seems to think that a form of self-deception is going on. The only explanation that seems to fit behind simple and unaccountable cowardice is that people misunderstand their role in life. Quote, "You sow your crops in order that he may ravage them. You install and furnish your homes to give him goods to pillage. You rear your daughters that he may gratify his lust. You bring up your children in order that he may confer upon them the greatest privilege he knows, to be led into his battles." End quote. In the main, though, de la Boetie is baffled at people's acceptance of domination, and he fails to understand the mechanisms of power that were even developing in his own life. Did he not realize that the same armies that the king sent to fight wars could be used to extract tribute from the people? Did he not understand the deprivations of poverty and want and subsistence agriculture? He did not understand what James Scott called the moral economy of the peasant, which suggests that peasants needed to accept exploitation as a basic universal survival strategy against an indifferent nature and against the tyrannous fate of history. To give a specific historical context, let's look at the American South. This will complicate the picture a little bit. De la Boetie wrote, how can he have so many arms to beat you with if he does not borrow them from you, end quote. Well, in the case of black workers in the American South, it seems that these arms did not come from black people themselves, but rather from racist whites, from courts, from discriminatory labor unions, from violent organizations, from lynchers, segregated schools, and on and on and on. You could say to me that this does not match De La Boetie's point because blacks were a minority in the Jim Crow South. Maybe, but power often works by posing some majority versus a different corresponding minority. The lines may not always be racial. Sometimes they're skill-based. Sometimes they're education-based. Sometimes they're ethnic. Sometimes they are the insider versus the outsider, the native versus the immigrant. And in the 500 years since De La Boetie lived, there is more than enough evidence that shows servitude is rarely voluntary and not merely the result of people passively accepting rule. So let us provisionally reject his view of domination as a bit too simple, but instead talk about a strategy for resistance, because it is a doozy and certainly very, very significant. Ettiene de la Boetie introduced in his essay on voluntary servitude the basics of civil disobedience. So after going through a long list of all the things that tyrants do to the people, he comments, "From all these indignities, such as the very beasts of the field would not endure, you can deliver yourself if you try, not by taking action, but merely by willing to be free. Resolve to serve no more, and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place your hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him, like the great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall on his own weight and break into pieces." Well, there it is. There's civil disobedience for you in a nutshell. Yeah, it might be still a little too simplistic and not very practical. It's not a strategy session. It's simply a statement about a principle. Certainly his view of power is a little bit too simple, so his theory of resistance is also bound by those same faults. But as the core of an idea, it's brilliantly stated by De La Boetie here. And De La Boetie is right about another thing. The majority are subjugated by a minority, even if the institutions and ideologies of power make this difficult to see. In a way, De La Boetie foreshadows the idea of the 99% versus the 1%, the slogan made popular by the Occupy Wall Street movement. De La Boetie knew that an individual cannot commit to civil disobedience effectively alone. It must be the entire people. He knew nothing of intersectionalism or identity politics, but he seemed here to think that the peasants and the clergy, the people of the cities and the people in the countryside, all the people of France, and it seems even the nobility, are the subjugated tools of one institution, one person, the monarchy and the monarch. De La Boetie himself, however, drew the line with the Protestant identity politics, refusing their right to worship openly when he himself was in the position of power to make policy. This makes it pretty hard to see intersectionalism on voluntary servitude, even if we squint very hard. Well, thanks for watching this video. For more of my videos on anarchist thinkers or for my reviews on American writers, please subscribe. And I'll be back next with Gerard Winstanley's The New Law of Righteousness.